Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us here on Wednesday afternoon for today's webinar. We will be discussing today what happens in a regulatory investigation. How can you protect from it? What happens if indeed it gets to that point? So by way of backdrop and why we feel this is an important topic, I just wanted to share some slides with yourself so you can see what we're talking about. So a simple Google search of fines in financial services will bring back a multitude of headlines. There's been recent news of EU fines relating to trading activity, fines coming out of Ireland around IT regulation and flaws, news from ASIC around treatment of customers, and from RBI around AML breaches. So fines are continuing to pick up at pace and investigations are continuing to pick at pace. Indeed, looking at the slide here, you can see from the FCA, if we come sort of more homeward bound, £189.8 million worth of fines were imposed last year. And that is 176 variations and cancellations of approvals and permissions. And if we drill into those final notices and those regulatory investigations, in the FCA, the main areas that have been looked at are unauthorized business, retail conduct, followed by insider dealing as those hot topics that the FCA have been looking at. So what we can see is that regulatory investigations are continuing at pace with large numbers attached to them. So what we want to do today is discuss actually what happens in an investigation. How do you preempt, and what do you need to do? Is there a playbook for the time should you get investigated? So joining me today are David Rundle and Matt Hancock. David Rundle is counsel at WilmerHale, a fin crime and regulatory enforcement specialist. And alongside him will be Matt Hancock. Matt is a member of the litigation practice working on contentious regulation in financial services. So before we enter into the sort of roundtable conversation, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions of the audience, if I may. So if we can just take a couple of seconds to answer this question. How well prepared is your organization if it were to come under investigation? So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to log your vote there. And then for the second question, in order to frame what we're going to talk about today, it'd be really interesting to find out what you're interested in. Would it be more to talk about when to report issues to the regulator? Early signs that an investigation might be coming? Having a playbook for how to respond? Or understanding the time and costs involved? So I'll just give you some time to answer those questions. So if we can just get a few more people answering those questions. Okay, so what we can see coming in at the moment is, okay, so roughly the answers coming out on the top of how well prepared is your organization. we are seeing roughly 2.8. So it's interesting. And then looking at early signs that an investigation might be coming and having a playbook for how to respond. Brilliant. So thank you very much for that feedback. So what we'll do now is open up the floor to the other two speakers who, let's be honest, are much more interesting than myself. And on that backdrop of those survey results, I would like to welcome you both. And I will kick off asking, I guess, to yourself, Matt, if that is all right, getting you started. So if we sort of run through those points and what people were looking at there, I think if we put it in this way, let's sort of think about before an investigation even sort of comes to your doorstep.
Sure.
What advice can you give? What can a firm do before the investigation starts? And actually, is it possible to see it coming?
It's a great question, and a whole series of issues there. First of all, nice to be here, and thank you very much for having me along. So the whole series of issues there. Obviously, for the majority of firms, indeed probably all firms, investigations are going to be a sort of once in a career event. And so, whilst there's a large number of them going through at any given time, around about 500, there's also a huge number of regulated firms in the UK, sort of well over 50,000. So the chances of being under investigation are comparatively slim. But to the point about whether one can see it coming and what to do about it, can you see it coming? Well, it really depends. I mean, plainly, if you have instances of serious misconduct that you have self-reported, then yes, one can see it coming. On a more day-to-day basis, it's harder to tell. But certainly what the FCA in particular do is they're very vocal about areas of focus. They push certain themes at certain times because they're resource constrained. And so, for example, they will put papers out. They will write Dear CEO letters where they make explicit their interest in certain themes. And firms that are operating within those sectors or have those themes as relevant to what they're doing by way of business, obviously recognize that they are sort of potentially in the FCA's scope. But unless you are, as I say, unless you've sort of reported something egregious to the regulator yourself, or, for example, something we may come on to discuss, unless you're otherwise dealing with them, for example, you're dealing with supervision, then it can be quite hard to say with certainty that something's coming around the corner.
Okay, think of that. So I guess building upon that, David, welcome as well. Do you have anything to build on, or do you echo with Matt's comments there? And we've looked at maybe seeing it coming, but could you also, might you be able to avoid an investigation in the first place?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. I agree with Matt. I think the only wrinkle on that I'd say is that it may be quite difficult to necessarily, assuming you haven't reported it yourself, to necessarily anticipate FCA general interest. But in most cases, in my experience, you would at least find that there would be some preliminary interest from the regulator, maybe through different channels. So you might, for example, get the interest of supervision, who ultimately, might consider the position, consider the evidence, and refer the case to enforcement. But you do have that window of opportunity, certainly pre-enforcement, and particularly through the channels that you have with supervision, to engage with the regulator as you're required to do. And in certain circumstances, I think you have some scope to affect not only the binary question of whether or not enforcement will be initiated, but also to shape perhaps what that case might look like. And so to your second question about whether or not you can potentially prevent an enforcement investigation, I think there are certain things that you can do, some proactive steps that you can take, certainly to reduce the chances an enforcement action will be taken. And, one of those things, for example, is thinking about remediation and thinking about addressing harm. Because ultimately, if a case is considered internally, one of the things that enforcement is going to look at is how harmful was this behavior and what has the firm done to remediate it in the meantime. So I think if you do address those things and address them quickly, you might have a better set of circumstances being presented under the nose of the head of department in enforcement, or even internal discussions, which negate the need for supervision, at least, to think that there is a case to refer or a need to refer it in all the circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think for firms in that situation, where they have, for example, there was the recent Red Centric case, which is a sort of case in point there of a sort of self-imposed remediation package in the face of really serious market abuse allegations. I mean, plainly, if a firm knows that kind of serious investigation is coming down the track, and it's effectively inevitable. I mean, I think an investigation had been started before they put the remediation in place. But if you know that's coming, then that kind of dramatic step is something which is, David's absolutely right, is a sensible step to take, and may well enable you to sort of divert the firm away from enforcement. But for boards, that's a really tough call for conduct or issues that are less serious or less egregious than that. And pick an example. Some kind of significant systems and control type failure. It takes a very strong and robust board, particularly given now we're in the world of SMCR and individual director responsibility, to go to the FCA and say, yeah, we have completely got this around our ankles, and actually we're going to be remediating customers in some kind of way. I mean, systems and controls are unlikely to lead to remediation, but you take the point. Those can be tough. Those can be tough calls. But I think the overall message is, to the extent that you do feel that you've got an issue, oftentimes some kind of engagement, whether it's offering something as dramatic as a remediation package or just managing a conversation around about a notification, can help kind of avoid enforcement. And that reflects the fact that in large part the enforcement are resource constrained. They can't bring all the cases that they want to bring, and it's a great guiding principle when you're dealing with the FCA generally to take them. It sounds kind of slightly cliche, but to take them on the journey with you. And for some misconduct, some issues, that won't be enough. But if you can say to them, this is the issue, we've discovered it, this is what we're planning to do about it. This is why we're going to bring ourselves back into line. Then there's a chance. But as I say, to go down that route is a tough call, because it's going to require some kind of pain, whereas for some firms, they will inevitably always just want to take the chance that it won't happen, and they'll continue without sort of telling the FCA, in effect, that there's been a problem.
Yeah, and I guess that brings me on to my next thought about, you both mentioned this sort of self-reporting and engaging with the regulator. I mean, when do you report an issue to the regulator? Could it be that some of these people are reporting too early, or not, or they're over-reporting? I mean, when should you report, really? I guess I'll open that to David.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, this question, and I think, the standard is, which is completely unhelpful, of course, when would the regulator reasonably expect notice? That of itself doesn't really get you anywhere. But I think what's important to ask first and foremost is, why would the regulator care? And what would the regulator be able to do about it? Because those are the two things which will really direct the regulator as to its significance. If it's something really historic, has since been solved, there's no ongoing crystallized risk, the people have left, then you may have a bit more time to play with. Having said that, I do believe that the regulator is getting increasingly more strict and has increasingly more significant expectations shortening expectations of when a disclosure is to be made. And there's case law about that and final notices about that, which people can go and read. But my personal experience of this is that, generally speaking, clients are looking to delay a disclosure, not for any nefarious purpose, but simply because of a keenness to understand more, a concern by people that are general counsels or associate general counsels, concerned that if they raise something with the regulator, 1,000 questions are going to come back which they cannot answer. And my response to them is usually better to get it in early, right? Because my general sense is that supervision will allow you more time, provided the situation is not so pressing that there's a real risk of immediate harm or ongoing harm. They will give you that time to come back, and better to get it in and then have a more controlled dialogue with the FCA. And if it falls into that latter category, where there is a real pressing concern about crystallized risk, and that probably tells you all you need to know about disclosure anyway. And it's a situation where the regulator would expect more immediate notice. So I always err on the side of caution. I always tell clients to err on the side of caution, because I think that the concerns that clients have, generally speaking, whilst entirely understandable, I think don't necessarily play out the way that people think they think they will. And I think the supervision gives you a bit more time than you might otherwise think.
Yeah, I would completely echo that. I mean, I think, David, you and I have probably spent huge amounts of time agonizing with clients as to whether or not they should disclose, and in what form they should disclose, and what it should look like. And as you rightly say, almost by definition, to the extent you're agonizing, it may well tell a story about the extent to which you should be notifying in the first place. In other words, you should be, because there is a potential issue. But having done that agonizing, by and large, and of course, there's no guarantees in this life, especially not with the FCA, and they've got 6 years to, once they discover something, to do something about it. Well, to get to warning notice stage. So they've got time, but by and large, you agonize about these things. It goes in, and then it's it's sort of the nicest possible way. It sinks without trace, which is great. And obviously, you don't get anything back from the regulator saying we're completely cool with this. But you don't get people coming in through the windows, which is what clients can often fear. So, but the self-notification thing is a huge part, and I think it's a problem, because firms quite often get themselves in a pickle, and don't feel able to have a dialogue with the regulator in a way that one would normally expect. And in a sense, there's a sort of unfairness in a way, because some of the larger firms will have regular contact with the regulators in a way that smaller firms won't, and so they may feel perversely unable to have that more open dialogue. Although in truth, I don't think anybody really has a genuinely open and collaborative dialogue with the regulator, which is unfortunate. But that's the way it is. But I mean, an allied point to this is, and whether they're linked or not, I don't really know, but they feel in the same conversation is, we also see a massive uptick in the level of whistleblowing, particularly during COVID, which is kind of fascinating from a sort of psychological perspective. But, that is almost the kind of flip side of the notification issue, firms carefully managing with lawyers whether and how to notify. But then on the other side, you've got somebody who, staff, employees who are increasingly more comfortable culturally in this country with the concept of whistleblowing and this wider public good, because you don't get paid in this country to do it. They're blowing the whistle and making those notifications directly to the regulators themselves in certain cases. And that, for many firms, that's a real challenge to manage that risk, and to deal with that kind of process properly. And many of them don't, but obviously they can't get their arms around it and manage it in the same way as they can with their own notifications.
Okay, brilliant. That's really insightful. I'm just going to quickly flip over to a question that's come in from the audience, if that's okay, before I sort of move on with my thoughts. It's to do with this continuing question of notifying the regulator. So the question is, in terms of notifying the regulator of an issue, many firms have incident management processes that assign a rating to an incident. Is it appropriate for firms to set a notification policy that aligns with the more major significant incidents? Which one would like to have a stab at that?
It is a really interesting question. I must say I hadn't come across. Well, I come across policy, but the idea of classifying the incidents is quite interesting. The only thing I would say about that, I suppose, is the devil will be in the detail. How the policy seeks to classify and I suppose rate the severity of any incident, which would then be translated into and interpreted to a decision as to whether or not it would be disclosable. I think really it would be the key question there. Firms need to be thinking not only about the specific provisions under PRIN 11, the general provision under PRIN 11, but also there are other more specific notification requirements, particularly around individuals and their fitness and propriety, and the question over whether or not they may have breached a conduct rule. So I think there's two things which would need to be built into that model. In respect of the first one, the general notification, I think there is a way where you could have a series of considerations, almost a tick box approach, at least as a first stab, to try and understand roughly where this incident falls. For example, what is the level of consumer harm, potential consumer harm? What is the likelihood that this may cause reputational risk to the firm? What is the likelihood that it may undermine the financial services sector at large? And I think if you have those criteria built in, broadly, which are reflected in the FCA handbook, then I think that's a very, very good, I suppose, kind of opening kind of pass of what you might think is disclosable or not. It also, of course, gives rise to a very, very solid and appropriate, I suppose, record keeping process. So if ever the decision not to disclose was considered by the FCA, and that of course happens many times, then at least you would have something a bit more robust and identifiable by which you could justify that decision. So as long as the policy is sound, I can see that there would be some sense in that. Ultimately, of course, there may be some feel about something which tells you something different, or you may get external counsel, or you may get internal advice, and they may say, well, look, I'm just too nervous about this. But I think as an initial opening assessment, I think it sounds like an interesting idea. Good idea.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think for the broader Principle 11 type, tell us things we ought to know about, it's a good idea, but you have to keep in mind, as you say, David, the triggers in the handbook for notifications around about CoCon breaches, fitness and propriety breaches, but also the sub 15 things about, if there's major litigation brought against the firm, or there's a systems and controls issue that's at a certain level, those are hard triggers that would have to be built in to that as well. But it's a really interesting idea, not one that I'd come across either.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for those responses. Audience member, thank you for asking the question. I hope that answered it for you. Okay, so I'm going to move forward now in our conversation. We've discussed sort of, preempting, what you could do there, what happens when you self-notify. Let's take it to, should the worst happen and an investigation, a regulatory investigation is launched. I think I probably know the answer to this, but is there a defined approach that you would recommend, or call it playbook, that you would recommend a firm to follow? Or is it a case of each one is different?
Well, look, from my perspective, you mentioned the playbook, and if there is a playbook out there, I'd certainly like to buy a copy, because to a degree, you're absolutely right. It depends on the firm, the issue, what the case against it is. I think that there are certain precepts, or how you want to put it, tenets about how one kind of goes forward in an investigation if it's started. I think, and I'm sure David would agree with this, that there's a degree to which, whether you're an individual under investigation or a firm under investigation, it's really key that in parallel with whatever the FCA is doing, that you understand as quickly and as comprehensively as possible what your own position is on it. not only because you're going to be faced with requests for documents and information, but also because there's going to be likely a process of interviewing before you put your statement out and or put something in the form of representations. But it's really key to have a position, whether that is defending it in total or accepting some kind of responsibility and limiting the extent of those concessions and defending aspects of it. And the reason for that really is it's kind of obvious in a sense, but well, two reasons predominantly. One, both for firms and individuals, it allows you to figure out the extent to which you're in trouble. Because you'll take advice and you'll have a view on that from the get-go, which is hugely important. So you can assess and cater and account for the risk that you're really facing. But second, because there's been a number of cases before the FCA, for those who kind of follow these things, thinking in particular of Arif Hussain, but it also came up in Frensham recently in the upper tribunal, where people have got into difficulty and have been criticised by the regulator in more stringent terms than they would otherwise have been, because they've changed their story halfway through the process. And so they've said, oh, actually, well, I said it was A, but it is in fact B. And then they're accused of lying about as part of the process. And so, the upper tribunal recently said in Frensham, I think it was in Frensham, that it's as much to do with how this thing is treated as it is the underlying incident itself. And so avoiding the situation where you straight off the bat say, absolutely, this didn't happen, it was this other big kid did it and ran away, and then 5 months down the track you're saying, okay, maybe this did happen, and actually it wasn't quite like that, instantly damages credibility. So is there a playbook? No, but one important aspect is to get to a position, a good understanding of what's happened as quickly as possible.
I mean, that was the thrust of my response, would have been my response, and completely agree with that. And I also agree with the general point that it is difficult to set out exactly a kind of playbook of other steps that you would necessarily take, not least of all because as well as all of these cases being different set of facts, different people involved, different case theories, different regulatory teams, there's also just the bare reality that the process is generally regulator-led. So there is particularly at the beginning of an investigation, it's a relatively reactive process. The FCA sends you the notice and memorandum. They tell you broadly what the case is about. And then typically they will embark upon kind of ever more increasingly kind of detailed questions or information fact-finding, initially, but perhaps by just kind of narrative requests, and then thereafter by specific documents and then emails, and you're kind of reacting to that. But I think what's really important, as Matt says, is that you cannot allow the process to let you be passive, because you really have to get to grips with the facts fast. You really need to be ahead of the regulator. You really need to understand the context, the business which you're dealing with, because whilst, as Matt said at the beginning of the call, whilst this may be a once-in-career event for many of the people who go through it, for us, we do this all the time, but we're dealing with very, very different situations. We're dealing with very, very different aspects of business. It could be a trading case, it could be a retail case. And then so we're coming in really as lawyers quite fresh to it, and we have to get up to speed with the subject matter. So as kind of lawyers, I think that's really critical. But as a team defending it, I think it is really, really important to have a clear, or at least a series of clear defense theories. You need to know ultimately what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and you need to have a broad sense of where you are going with this, because although it's a reactive process, how you respond, the extent to which you kind of proactively provide additional information, the extent of the kind of quality of your cooperation might all be affected by how you view the process and how you view the strength ultimately of your argument. So I agree. I think it's really important to get to grips with it from the outset and have some clear sense of where you're ultimately trying to get to.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sorry.
Go ahead, Matt.
No, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, that's absolutely right. And, there are any number of calls within that moment, that there's initial moment, and I say moment, I mean, it's going to be in reality, information gathering, as part of the initial process may take months, sometimes even longer. But there's any number of calls that need to be taken that are going to be informed by your understanding of where the case is, and, where you're strong, where you're weak. And so, for example, two things that immediately come to mind, or three things actually that immediately come to mind that might be useful to speak about. One, for example, your approach to interviews, particularly where there's criminal allegations being made against you, and you need not speak, but whether you answer questions. Two, to the extent that information requirements come in, but actually you feel you want to try and shape those information requirements to best suit where you're stronger. And then three, the extent to which you are, particularly for firms, one of the issues for firms in particular is that you are in the process of dealing with an investigation, often creating material which might damage you in the context of that investigation. So you need to be kind of thinking about privilege, but particularly owning that, owning the issue of privilege, and considering to what extent you can try and cloak or try and run a privileged process aside from what the FCA is doing that will create some kind of useful product, whether that's something you want to countenance doing, either in order to disclose it ultimately to the FCA as some kind of solution or some kind of sort of self-imposed investigation, or whether it's just so you can understand a bit more about what's going on. But I mean, the twin track thing might be a good thing for you to take, David. I mean, that's in terms of how that might inform your approach, for example, to an interview, if that's not an unfair.
Yeah, no. Dual track investigations are becoming increasingly more common, in part because the regulator is very, very interested in, and has been for the last couple of years, very interested in money laundering cases. We've seen recently the NatWest money laundering case, which was dealt with by way of a criminal plea. And so, Matt and I have dealt with a case where it started off as a dual track investigation, and it does naturally change your perspective, how you approach the case. But I think principally it changes it because of the interview, and you have an opportunity where you wouldn't if it was a compelled process to exercise your right to silence. And for lots of the people that Matt and I deal with, I mean, the criminal allegation is scary for anyone, don't get me wrong, but lots of the people, it is just cataclysmic. They cannot fathom how they've got here. So it is a really, really high risk decision, and of course, telling some of these people that, contrary to all of their instincts about how they should operate with the regulator, to tell them that it's probably in their interests to exercise their right to silence and keep their powder dry is really tough information to take. So lots of our time would be spent trying to explain that decision to them. But I agree, it's a critical decision. The interviews are critical, not just for suspects of regulatory investigations, subjects of investigations, but also if you are representing a firm, the interview process is really a great opportunity to set the agenda, to turn the narrative, to get someone before the FCA who is the face of the facts, who they might think is credible, and inevitably they're human beings, people in enforcement. They will walk away, and if they've been impressed by that individual, if they think that person is credible and persuasive, then it's going to have a really, really significant impact on the case, irrespective really of subject matter. It's really about presentation. So the interview is really, really important.
And presumably you find, sorry,
I was going to say that sort of answers one of the questions I was going to sort of have, and maybe, sorry, Matt. But you mentioned there about, initially you mentioned that the FCA, it's pretty much led by the regulator. You're more in a reactive state, and you just mentioned there actually about setting the agenda. So, I mean, is there that opportunity therefore, and you kind of touched upon it there with the interview, to actually wrestle that power back and actually set the agenda or shift the focus of a regulatory investigation?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I think that David's right. I mean, the FCA, obviously, they start an investigation because they believe a certain thing has happened and they will have a broad sense of what's gone on. At an interview, you do have an opportunity to try and move them away from that that kind of case theory. Although, of course, the FCA may well say, "Well, you would say that, wouldn't you?" And might not believe that you're speaking the truth, or that you're overstating certain aspects of it. But there is an opportunity to sort of nudge it either which way. I mean, I think it's been my experience that to the extent that investigations stop, they often stop after the interview, because it's a moment where, either because, as David says, the way things are presented, or because of what's said, enforcement realize that they've actually got this wrong, or perhaps that it's just not nearly as serious to the extent that something has gone wrong. So the interview can be a way of changing the agenda. And even in situations where you give a no comment interview, you might choose to give some kind of prepared statement at the end. I've also had cases where on the back of an interview, and in certain circumstances, for example, it may be appropriate to put in a document after an interview to really try and push a case in a particular direction, to get rid of it, or to try and push it in a particular way. In some cases, have had success in serving expert evidence immediately after the interview, just in order to try and sort of bring it to a swift conclusion. So those are all ways in which one can try and sort of close it off quickly, or try and sort of nudge it. But it is, I think, generally been my experience that it is quite tough to do that, especially where the FCA feel, rightly or wrongly, that they've got there's blood in the water, and that there's something there. And in those circumstances, and again, it goes to the point about the importance of having a view as to where you sit before the interview. In those circumstances, it may be better to go down the less is more kind of approach, rather than tying yourselves in knots too much, trying to deflect away from the issue. Because I think it is hard generally to try and meaningfully shift the agenda of an investigation. But it's tough because, and this goes to another conversation, the no comment approach. It may well be that, post a no comment interview, and I don't know what your experience of this is, David, that things might come to an end after that, but the likelihood is, by not putting anything further out there, it's unlikely that the regulator is going to say, maybe there is nothing doing here, we should stop. So you are signing up to a longer process in ways that many clients aren't going to want. Maybe they may be months down the track, potentially more than that, since the investigation started, and they may just be saying to you, do anything you can, take any shot, any risk to try and get rid of it now, rather than playing a long game. But again, that all comes back to how you view the severity or risk of this thing going against you ultimately.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Matt. David, I would normally let you have a response as well, but I'm going to, just in the interest of time, we've got some audience questions coming in, which I want to shift to, if that's okay. So the audience question that I'll ask now is, will the focus and approach to investigations be different in 5 years? David, do you want to have a...
Well, the sad truth is that many of the investigations that the FCA commences today will still be around in 5 years, because that's how slow the process moves. So I think it's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about this one, and I would be surprised if it would change radically in 5 years, because I think that the FCA has been fairly consistent. There have been marginal changes. I think the FCA has become a bit more dynamic. I think the biggest change of how the FCA more generally reacts to the market will probably be not so much in how enforcement investigations are themselves conducted, but the use by the FCA of alternative powers. And there's been, recently lots of press commentary, been a paper by the FCA announcing that it intends to rein back some of the control back to the executive instead of having the RDC, the Internal Regulatory Decisions Committee, deal with many of the issues which it would typically deal with. So it is essentially short-circuiting the RDC process, and it is making decisions summarily, I shouldn't say summarily, through the executive. So the decision-making process for not for enforcement investigations, but certainly for issues around authorizations, for issues around related supervision issues, will become faster. And lots of people, lots of commentators would say they will result in a reduction and erosion of due process because of that. I think that's a fair assumption. Time will tell, but I think that's probably going to be a change which will happen in the next 5 years, rather than how enforcement cases themselves are dealt with.
Excellent, thanks for that, Matt. I'm going to ask you a separate question. We've got, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to time constrain you to a 60-second answer, if that's all right. Maybe the question, though, is quite a weighty one. So the audience question is: the survey asked for a 1 to 5 response. What's your feeling on where most companies are? 2, 3. Do you feel anyone's at a 4 or 5? And if so, what's the key way in which they differ from the rest of us?
It's an interesting question. 60 seconds are ticking. Gosh, in a way, this isn't meant to be a cute response, but in a way, the more prepared you are for an investigation, the more likely is that something's gone wrong. I think most firms going about their day-to-day business probably aren't prepared for an investigation. The kinds of things that you would really want to have, certainly as a lawyer going into defending a firm against an FCA investigation, is, for example, a very clear division in terms of where documents are kept, a very clear understanding of what is privileged, benefits from legal privilege, advice privilege, that means you don't have to disclose it, where certain categories of documents are stored, making sure that the company, the entity, has complied with all of its data storage requirements, and that all these things, such like Bloomberg chats and calls, are easily accessible. So those kinds of things, document retention things, are probably things that most firms in a good place day to day will have. But firms that are really thinking about what happens if the FCA come knocking, I mean, the reality is that nobody really runs a business in that way, and if they do, they're probably towards the enforcement is probably more likely because something's gone wrong. So, short answer, 60 seconds. I think most firms probably aren't prepared for enforcement, but there are things that they need to do as part of the day-to-day vis-a-vis documents that mean that they're probably in a relatively good place.
Fantastic. So we're going to have to wrap up there. We've hit our 45 minutes. All that remains for me to say is thank you ever so much, David and Matt, for joining us today. I've really enjoyed listening to you. I think the audience has taken away some really key information there. Other questions that have been asked, I will share with David and Matt for answering offline. But if you did ask a question that we haven't got to today, I will make sure we get those answers to you. The recording of this will be available shortly online. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.